and we're going to get started. We have a lot to cover again today, even though we're really digging with just one text today. I was telling someone that I prepared extensively today, and I was going through all my notes to time and see how much time I had this morning, and I got to a major section and ran out of time. So we are going to continue this conversation next week. There's going to be part 1 and part 2 of Romans. Somebody asked me, though, this is the third of our 4 weeks. So next week is our last week together to do this Bible study as an all-church Bible study. After that, we'll be back to our normal regular schedule for Sunday school. Welcome. For those of you some of you haven't been here for any of our other 2 weeks. Some of you have been here for one, but not the other, which is fine. We are also working on getting a web page put together on our web page, but a sub page that has the handouts as well as a video of this conversation. So those resources will be on the web if you missed a week and want to go back and hear more about those particular texts that we explored. And hopefully we'll have some of that up, at least some of it up this week. It takes a little bit of time and work. I want to thank Darren especially for all the work he's been doing of editing those videos and helping us get that put together. So in case you haven't been here, or in case you have and you haven't heard me, I want to lay out a couple of my assumptions and disclaimers. The first week I had a number of assumptions and disclaimers, and I'm not going to give those all to you today. But the one assumption that I think is key that I want to keep repeating to you is that I am assuming that all of us in this room, us as a church, all of us sincerely have a desire to reflect the heart of Jesus as we consider this conversation. That whether you agree with the person sitting next to you or you disagree with the person sitting next to you, whether you agree or disagree with my perspective, that all of us here ultimately are coming with the same foundation, that we want to be a people who are embodying the heart of Jesus. And that is true whether or not we have the same perspective on this. And so that's one of my assumptions. That's what defines us and unites us as a church, and I want to keep coming back to that. An assumption I'm not making, and I keep saying this too, I'm not making the assumption that at the end of 4 weeks, everybody is going to think the same or interpret the Bible the same. I don't think that at the end of this conversation, everyone in our church will think the same around this. I don't think that's, I think that would be kind of silly to assume that would happen. But I do have some very particular hopes. I hope we have a better understanding in this Bible study in particular. I hope we have a better understanding of the biblical texts, of how they've been used, at times how they've been misused, and also why some individuals read particular biblical texts differently than perhaps you do. And maybe overall you're a better reader of the Bible and a better handler of this conversation one way or another. Another disclaimer is this is a Bible study, but I have limited time, and so I'm not going to answer all your questions. So again, I want to point out that there is a sheet of paper on your table. Unless you're at this table, you do not have sheets of paper because that was set up for lunch. There might be some sheets of paper behind that yellow sign. So Margot, will you do me a favor and and they've got some extra there, and we can share some pens. I want everybody to take a sheet of paper and a pen, and I want you, if you're willing to write your name on it, you don't have to, but if you're willing, that's helpful. This is a piece of paper for you to write down your questions and submit those questions in the basket over there where there's that yellow piece of paper in a basket. I'm not going to be able to answer all your questions, and you will have things that come up in your mind. I want you to write those down because that's really helpful. Let me just say that we've had 2 weeks now of questions being submitted, and we've had some really good, insightful questions, practical questions, insightful questions. I am going to try to answer some of those questions in particular next week. I'm going to try to work through some of those in a very particular, direct way. Some of those questions will be indirectly answered today in our Bible study, but I'm going to try to directly work with some of those questions. So write your questions down, submit them, and if your question doesn't get answered in this Bible study, know that the resource team will also be working on that, and you can always come and talk to me individually. Okay, so a quick review. Last week, we dealt with the 3 Old Testament texts that are in question, the 3 Old Testament texts that deal particularly with same-sex attraction. Let me just also make one quick disclaimer as my kids are walking through. Some of you might also have younger people with you. Know that our conversation today is a little more PG-13 rated than our previous conversations, and so if you have a middle schooler or somebody that you would like to be a helper in the children's Sunday school class, they are welcome to do that. Parents, that's your job to make that decision. Just so you know, it's a little more PG-13 today. So last week, we talked about Genesis 19 and the sin of Sodom, right? And who can tell me what the Bible itself says is the sin of Sodom or some of the sins of Sodom? Anybody remember, Alex?
Sexual violence.
Sexual violence.
Greed.
Greed. All right. What else? Not caring for the outsider. Inhospitality. Not caring for the oppressed, the poor. The Bible itself in multiple places references the sins of Sodom, and that is what it says the sin of Sodom is. Even traditionalists agree that this story is not a story about homosexuality, and so it has been misinterpreted in the history of the church to be so. So that one's off the list. I hope that we all know that. If we want to think seriously about the sin of Sodom, we think, especially if we think about the sexual sin of Sodom, we need to address sexual violence in our culture today. Okay, Leviticus 18 and 22, we talked about 18 and 20, we talked about a Hebrew word that's translated abomination or detestable. That Hebrew word is?
Toeva.
Toeva. You probably said it better than I did. I was saying tova, but it's probably toeva. That's right. That Hebrew word is used 117 times in the Old Testament to describe things that are detestable or an abomination. And of those 117 times, 111 of them are used to describe something other than same-sex eroticism. What are some of those things that we are all guilty of that are abominations?
Eating pork.
Eating pork, bacon, sausage. Anybody have that for breakfast? John did last week, I think, so he's still feeling guilty. What else?
Eating shrimp.
Eating shrimp. Eating lobster, shellfish are an abomination. What else?
Mixed cloth.
Mixed cloth. That's right. Having cloth or clothes that are made of 2 different kinds of cloth together. Probably the clothes you're wearing today is an abomination. What else?
Trimming your beard, I think.
Maybe that was one we didn't cover. Trimming your beard. Okay.
Putting 2 seeds in the same.
Putting 2 seeds in the same field. Planting 2 different kinds of crops is an abomination. And many other things. Other sexual acts that are normal in our marriages today were considered an abomination by them because they weren't primarily oriented towards procreation. And we're going to get back to that a later today. So, lots of things are abomination. What we basically said is it's not grounds for this argument in and of itself. Or if you're picking out those couple verses in light of the 117 things, you need to have great justification for why. Okay, today we are getting to the real heart of the argument. This is where the real conversation is happening among scholars today, and that's in Romans 1. So I want everybody to get out your Bibles. We're going to be looking at Romans 1 extensively and how Romans 1 intersects with Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. We're going to be looking at the best traditional argument that scholars are using, as well as counter arguments that scholars are using. But Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 32. 24 to 32. What I want you to do at your tables right now is to read that out loud to each other. Pick somebody at your table to read that, and everybody read that together, okay? Go ahead. All right, there you have it. So this is the key text, the primary text that is talked about again and again, the primary text that the leading traditionalist scholars point to, as well as the primary text that the leading non-traditionalist scholars will argue with their interpretation. A couple things about the conversation, and we're going to get pretty technical and a little philosophical today. That's because I really want you to understand this conversation. At the heart of this conversation is an idea called gender complementarity. And gender complementarity is the leading scholar that's emphasizing this is Robert Gagnon. Basically, gender complementarity is the idea that the two genders created at the beginning, we're going to get to Genesis in just a minute, were created to complement one another. And that's God's intention in creation, and so they complement one another in a number of ways. Now, one of the things that has to be recognized is that there are several different versions or definitions of gender complementarity, and how do the people who hold this view, how they will describe the two genders complementing one another. And in many circles, in some Baptist circles, a conversation that we are familiar with is that different genders have different roles. This is where the sort of the philosophical underlying of why women shouldn't preach or women shouldn't be the head of their household, because different genders have different roles. Not that they're of less value, but they have different roles. Men have particular roles, women have different roles. Together they complement one another. That's one way that gender complementarianism is used. Another one, and maybe the more important one for us today, is what's sometimes called anatomical complementarity. And it has to do with the anatomy of the man and the woman and how those anatomies naturally fit together. Clearly, there is a complementary nature to those. What's important to recognize, and there's a few other ways that this is talked about, what's important to know about gender complementarity is this is the key essence, the underlying sort of philosophical thought that holds the traditional view. It also is not consistently applied across the scholars. So if you look at different scholars who hold this view, what appears to be the case, because they will argue with each other about what it means, is that they are imposing into this idea their own preconceived notions of the roles of different genders. They don't all agree on that. So the foundation of that has a little bit of question on what exactly is gender complementarity. But it has to do a lot in Romans with Paul's words about what's natural and unnatural. And we hear about women exchanging natural sex for unnatural, as well as men. And these things are all tied back then to Genesis 1, 26 to 28, and then Genesis 2, what are those verses? 15, I think. 18 to 25, thank you. 18 to 25. And just a quick review of these. Genesis 1, 26 and 28. We're going to dig into it more in a little bit, but just a quick review. This is the first creation account, and at the end of the six days of creation, on day 6, God creates humanity. And there's this verse that's really beautiful. In God's image, we create them, male and female, they are created. So it's there from the beginning, this perspective has, that God intentionally creates humanity with two genders, and these two genders are supposed to complement each other. And then right after male and female, now male and female go and be fruitful and multiply and fulfill the earth. So the purpose of male and female, the purpose of sexual relationships is procreation. So that's based here and backed up by Genesis 1. And Genesis 2 is the second creation account of story, and you might remember that this is a story where a woman is made out of man, and together, God creates a helper out of the side of the human. They become male and female, and then the two come together, and together they become one flesh. And the idea is that one flesh, what it's talking about, it's restoring the original unity of the human that was separated into two genders. So that's the conversation happening there, that one flesh is a restoration primarily in the sex act of a restoration of the two genders coming back together into one. So the larger focus becomes really on anatomical complementarity. How's that for a mouthful? And what you start to see then in these is what nature teaches. This is what Robert Gagnon. What nature teaches most centrally about sex is the anatomical fittedness of the male penis and the female vagina. So that's gender complementarity and the traditional perspective, and really the ground basis for that. It's all here, and it makes sense to a lot of people. You could see, and certainly I hope everybody can understand that line of thinking and the logic that's all happening in here. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into Genesis 1 and 2, and I'm going to have us explore maybe some questions about those interpretations. Then we're going to dig into Romans 1, natural and unnatural, and what does Paul mean by natural and unnatural. What we're not going to get to this week that I'd hoped to is when Paul describes it as shameful, as this passion that's degrading, this lust that God gives them over to. What does he have in mind when he's using those descriptors? We're going to get to that next week in Romans 1, okay? So I just want you to know that. Before we do that, I want to show you a quick little video, as I've done each week. This week we're going to hear a little bit from someone whose name is Julie Rogers. Julie is actually a friend of one of my colleagues in my D-Min program. So I was first heard about her through a friend of mine in my D-Min program. They went to college together. Julie grew up in Dallas in a conservative Christian home, and in high school starts to wrestle with her sexual orientation, tries hard not to be gay. She actually then goes, and we're going to hear a little bit about this, how she signs up and participates in the largest ex-gay ministries, Exodus International, which is one of those we talked about the first week, a ministry that works hard to change a person's sexual attraction. So the underlying philosophy is, she'll reference this at some point, that you're not gay, you have the problem of same-sex attraction. Gayness is not an orientation or an identity. So through therapy and prayer and work, you can change that. And so she becomes a participant in this. She actually becomes a spokesman for that organization. She's going to tell a little bit about her story and we're going to hear a little more of her story at the end and how she processed that role. But personally, we're doing this I want us to hear from different people each week for a few reasons. One, I think it's fundamentally essential in any conversation like this that we remember we are not talking about ideas, that ultimately we are talking about people. And so as we have conversation and as we enter the Bible, we need to do that in relationship with people and with real people. And I really think the events in Charlottesville last week emphasize that, the way that when a group of people becomes an idea, how we totally misunderstand and can create all kinds of assumptions that are incorrect when we talk about a whole group of people and they can become the other. One of the things in relation to race issues that are courageous conversations the pastors have continued to say is, it's really hard to hate up close. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing. So that's partially why we're hearing the stories of Christians who also have wrestled with their sexual identity. We are doing what is often called practical theology. So rather than doing theology in an ivory tower disconnected from life, we're doing practical theology as it intersects with real life. That's the work of the church, and the pastoral task always is practical theology. So that's why we're hearing some of these stories. And this is just a little bit of Julie sharing the beginning of her story. This is a 5-minute clip. I'm sorry, one quick context that I forgot to give. Julie is speaking at a conference for Christians who identify as gay or as allies to people who would identify as part of the LGBTQ community. So that's her audience as she speaks, and that's what she's speaking to. Sorry about that.
It all started, well, it didn't quite all start here, but the drama started when I was 17 years old, the week of Valentine's Day in my junior year in high school. And I found myself in the passenger seat of my mom's white SUV on my way to go meet with an ex-gay minister in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The ministry was called Living Hope, and it was a member ministry of Exodus International, which most of you are probably familiar with, the largest sort of organization promoting hope for change, that you could be changed by the power of the gospel, and gay people could become straight. So I didn't want to be in that passenger seat when I was 17 years old, the week of coming out. But I came from a very conservative Christian background. I grew up in the Bible Belt in Texas, in sort of Southern Baptist churches, Bible churches, which is like Southern Baptist churches, at least in Texas. And I had always heard from a very young age that gay people were so disgusting. I remember my mom saying, like, lesbians are so disgusting. Like, look at them, like they're all like wearing sweater vests. That's how they signal to each other that they're gay. They wear sweater vests. Like, okay. Lesbians wear sweater vests. And I had to quit softball so that I wouldn't become gay. And it was like my whole sort of upbringing was like, okay, like don't wear sweater vests, don't play softball, don't be gay, don't be gay. And I actually homeschooled. That's the kind of like conservative Christian family we were. Do we have any homeschoolers in here? Woo-woo! So I didn't actually do school. There was like no arithmetic. I did a little reading because I enjoyed that, stories. But the goal of homeschooling was just to keep me away from the gays and goth kids and the people out there who were different. So that's sort of the background. That's what was going on by the time that I ended up in the SUV on the way to meet with the ex-gay minister. I did love Jesus. I had loved Jesus from a very young age. I remember just being drawn to the idea that the God who created beauty, the God who created the stars in the sky and the fishing pond outside of my house, wanted a relationship with me. That God saw me and actually came to earth as Jesus so that we could have a relationship. I was just moved by that. So I'm on my way to this ex-gay ministry. I'm like, what? I'm just gonna like go like hard ass on this because I don't know like what's about to go down. Just sort of like put up my barriers because I wanted God to love me and I wanted my family to like me. I wanted to be good, and good kids weren't gay, and so I was like, all right. Just a few months later, while I was at 17 years old, that ministry had me on their stage to give my ex-gay testimony for their donor banquet. So no 17-year-old has an ex-gay testimony. You just don't. I didn't know that. But what ended up happening was I shared, that I was choosing God over my sexuality, and that I had hope in what God would do, what kind of transformation God would bring as a result of that. And it apparently went well because that ministry sort of like took me on the road and had me continually giving my ex-gay testimony from the age of 17, then 17 and a half, then 18, then 18 and a half. And we just kept doing that for years and years and years. And I didn't realize at the time that meant I was going to be working through all of these very private, very intimate, very complicated questions about my sexuality, about theology, all these things. I was going to be working all those questions out on a public stage, which at that time was a very small one, but eventually would grow to be on a national stage, one of our culture's, and certainly the church's most heated debates. And so I would have made different choices at the age of 17 if I had realized that. But I saw it as my one last chance to be good. And I really wanted to be a good Christian. So I was in. By the time I was ready to go to college, I was being recruited by Division I schools all over the country to go play basketball. But my family was like, lesbians are everywhere in college basketball. So we made the decision that I was going to go to a Baptist school in Dallas, which to remain close to the ministry. And my life was really revolving around not being gay, as you can see. And so I was deeply involved in this ministry throughout college. And I was there for support group on Thursday nights. I was there for healing group, prayer group on Tuesday nights. I was there for lunch on Sundays. I even lived with the leader of this ex-gay ministry on and off throughout college and a little bit after. So I was like in, right?
She was all in. So that's just a little bit to help us understand, like, here's the narrative of one Christian who's trying to wrestle with this idea of God did not, it's not natural for her. God did not create her with this orientation. How do I then get to be right with God, and her entering into this ministry? We're going to hear a little bit more about that. I want us, though, first to dig in deeper to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. So on your handout there, you see digging deeper. Genesis 1, verse 26, 27, who is created in the image of God. I want you to, at your tables, have one person read those verses, the next person sitting next to them answer these very direct questions. How does the value of the woman compare to the man in the text? And how does this fit into a patriarchal worldview? I want a different person to answer each of those just very quickly, very direct, because we don't have a lot of time. And then to do Genesis 2, same thing, 18 through 23. There's actually 4 bullet points. We're going to start with the 3rd bullet point, and I'll explain the 4th one in a minute. But just read verse 18, what's the problem? Somebody read 19 to 22, what's the immediate response? And verse 21 to 23, why is the woman a suitable helper? Do that at your tables. We've got about 5 minutes to do all of that, so I need you to dive in quickly. Go.
Verse 18.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut you off. I'm sorry. I know that was not a lot of time to process those questions. What I think probably you didn't notice, but I'm going to point out to, well, let me ask this question. Did anybody in any of their translations read the word natural or unnatural in those texts? No, they're not there. So this is us extrapolating and pointing into this text, maybe something that's not there. And what I think might be interesting to consider is how the questions that we bring to the text change how we read the text. So our presuppositions and the questions that we're asking change the direction to where the text will lead us. So if we're asking the question, what is natural and unnatural, and we come to this text, we might get a certain set of answers. If we ask some of the questions that I asked there, it might lead you in a very different direction. And this is the direction that some of the other scholars will say now. So the emphasis in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, or 28, is an emphasis on the fact that both male and female are created in the image of God, which was an incredibly countercultural thing to say. The emphasis isn't about two genders that God's creating, but how male and female are created in the image of God. And that was a profound kind of radical thing to write in that story, elevating the value of men and women. Then God does give humanity this role of being fruitful and multiplying, and we know, and we'll explore more about how procreation has been seen as an essential part of marriage. It's still a part of Catholic teaching. Most Protestant churches, though, and our tradition included, and even in much more conservative Protestant traditions, do not think that procreation is an essential part of marriage. So there's a difference of interpretation around that text. Genesis 2, the problem there is what? The being alone. The problem is the man's being alone. And what scholars will point out is that the teaching of the traditional perspective re-emphasizes that problem, because the only option for someone with a same-sex orientation is lifelong celibacy. That's their only option. So that option reinforces the problem here at the very beginning of what is good and not good for humanity. So the response to that, God's response, is what in those next couple verses? It's kind of funny, isn't it? Like, now all the animals come marching across, and Adam starts naming them. Basically, it's the story of like Adam's looking around at these other created beings, and none of them are suitable. So a pet is not really a suitable partner for life. A pet's not going to be a good helper. It's not the same. And that's what the story seems to say. There was still no suitable helper that was found after Adam named all the animals. So out of the flesh of the human being, then God creates the woman. And there's this whole two-flesh the two becoming one. And I told you about how the traditionalists understand that the two becoming one flesh as a reuniting of that original oneness of humanity. What I would suggest is that, and what many scholars would suggest, is that this idea about one flesh isn't primarily about a reunion of the two physical bodies, but it's about a new kinship bond being created. So if you look at what it says there, it talks about leaving your own family and clinging to your spouse. A new kinship bond is being created in this sexual act and in this commitment. And so out of that kinship bond, that's something that transcends, that is perhaps enacted in sex, but it goes beyond the act of sex, and it's something that continues. And we see that idea of one flesh being primarily about a unitive bonding. That idea is used again and again in the scriptures when the scripture comes back and refers to this text. So in Ephesians chapter 5, we have that whole household code section where husbands love your wives, wives submit to your husbands, love them as Christ loves the church, and it becomes this whole metaphor for about Christ and our relationship with Christ. And at the end of that, the metaphor of the husbands and wives and Christ and the church, it quotes this verse from Genesis 2. And essentially what they're drawing from this idea that there is a unitive bonding that happens between Christ and the church, and the love of Christ and the church. And that's kind of laying a foundation or a way to go back and read this and say, okay, that's maybe the primary meaning of this text. As well as 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul talks about don't unite yourself with a prostitute, because then the two become one flesh. There's a permanent bonding that happens. So it's not about just that moment, but it's about the bonding that happens. So the way that the Bible itself seems to use this conversation this passage is mostly about unitive bonding. Now, I want us to look at two important words: normal versus normative, descriptive versus prescriptive. So something that is normal is something that you tend to see as the common pattern. Something that's normative is you prescribe this as the only pattern. Something that's descriptive is similar to normal. You're describing the reality. Something that's prescriptive, you're naming the only reality that's okay. And this is a really important paradigm, not just for this conversation, but for many, many, many parts of how we approach the Bible as we read these stories. Are these stories describing the reality, or are they prescribing the reality? This was first introduced to me outside of this conversation at all, just in seminary, as we were learning how to be better readers of the Bible. If we take all of the stories as being prescriptive, then most of us in here who are men should have probably multiple wives and not just one. Right? So there's a difference. That's a big way of just helping us to understand. There's a difference between being descriptive and prescriptive. And a lot of times, as you heard me talk some about in my sermon on scriptures back in June, a lot of times the Bible is being descriptive of the reality. So what I would suggest to you is in Genesis here, Scripture is assuming that this one flesh bondness, they're assuming that that's going to take place between men and women. They're writing about the reality that they're used to seeing. It's what they see as the normal pattern. It's descriptive. But there's nothing actually in the text itself that necessarily excludes committed gay or lesbian unions from being considered one flesh unions. In other words, what's normal in the biblical witness isn't always normative in different cultural settings. Because it's writing in one particular cultural setting, and it's not always prescriptive for all cultural settings. So that's important for part of how we approach Genesis 1 and 2. So here's my question. What does Paul mean by natural and unnatural, right? That's what we're trying to get back to. What does Paul mean by natural and unnatural? We've got a lot to get through to even get to Paul's understanding. But what I'd like you to do, one more time, is to read not all of that Romans passage, but to read Romans 1:24 through, what is it, 28, I think. Go ahead, and somebody at your, through 28. 24 to 28, read that at your tables one more time. Okay. So, in order for us to really dig into this text well, it's really important to think about, like, what is Paul in his mind referencing or thinking or imagining as he writes? What are his presuppositions as he comes to this? And we're going to get a lot to that as he talks about the lust and the degrading passions next week. But specifically, we need to deal with this question about natural and unnatural, because this was a common category used in the ancient world. Natural and unnatural. It was used by Stoic philosophers. And so what we see is then the Jewish writers that predate Paul and that are contemporaries of Paul and after Paul all start using that category as well of what's natural and unnatural. And it's really important for us to understand how do they use that word? Like when they're using the word natural and unnatural, what are their assumptions under what they're talking about? What do they mean by natural and unnatural? So first we're going to look at how does Paul use it. And one of the ways that Paul uses this word is to describe an individual's disposition. So what comes naturally to an individual? And we see this in Ephesians 2 verse 3. He talks about how it is natural for a wicked person to do wicked deeds. It's what their natural disposition is. So when he uses it, it's the same word he's using. He's talking about what's their subjective disposition. What comes naturally to that person? Well, an evil person, it's natural for them to do evil. So when he uses that word, he's not talking about some standard necessarily that's just there in creation. But part of what he's talking about is a person's natural disposition. We see the same thing in Romans chapter 2. If we just kind of go a few verses later, and you can look there in your Bibles in 2:14, he describes how for the good person, what comes instinctively is the way it's translated. It's the same word. What comes instinctively or naturally is good for the good person. So he's talking a little bit, not on the conformity to some external nature, but on conforming to what is inside your own nature, what's already written on your heart. And we hear this in his language about exchanging in Romans. So he says that they exchange what is natural for unnatural. Well, you can't exchange something that you don't already have. So he's talking some about a person's natural disposition. They're giving up what is natural for them. And Paul's assumption, what Paul clearly has in mind as he writes this, I think, is pretty obvious from his context. He clearly has in mind, and he's assuming people whose natural inclination is going to be towards heterosexual relationships. They're giving up, or they're exchanging, or they're leaving behind their natural inclination towards heterosexual relationships for something that goes against their own nature. You heard me say 2 weeks ago that the idea of sexual orientation, or even the word homosexuality, does not exist in the Bible or in the ancient world. And this is part of where we're starting to understand that. The idea of a person having a particular sexual orientation, an idea that's been verified by science and is widely accepted now, as distinct from sexual acts. Because they saw sexual acts, but as a person having sexual orientation, that concept doesn't even come into the world until the 18th century. So it's far from Paul's mind. He doesn't have any concept of a person having a natural orientation towards something other than heterosexual relationships. The idea of being gay does not exist in the ancient world or in Paul's mind. He doesn't know what we know now. Not only that there's a portion of the human population, but there's a large portion of the mammal population and multiple mammals that also exhibit same-sex behaviors. And there's you can go into the materials and see lots and lots and lots of different mammals who have this. So there is something natural that science says for a certain population, what's natural for them is same-sex relationship. So what you will hear then, what I think is fair to say, that for a gay or a lesbian person to enter into a heterosexual marriage, they are exchanging what's natural for them. And often you'll hear stories about how destructive that is for both partners in that marriage. The heartache that goes along with that, and the profound pain that comes from that, from trying to live out an identity that is not natural for one of those partners. So part of what Paul means is a person's inner disposition. And again, yes, he's assuming everybody's inner disposition is a heterosexual disposition. Part of what he means is the social order. And in Paul's world, the social order is defined by patriarchy, right? So what's important to realize, when the ancient writers are writing, they don't think about another culture and how that culture plays out. There's no anthropologists in the ancient world. What they see around them in their Greco-Roman Jewish context milieu, that is what is. And they all have a paradigm of patriarchy that is just naturally there. So Paul uses the word natural in this kind of context in 1 Corinthians 11. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 14 to 15, he says a man having long hair is against nature and degrading. It's against the normal social order of what a man is supposed to be in a patriarchal world, right? So Paul himself uses it as an inner disposition. Paul uses the word natural to describe what is the social order, what's supposed to be. And remember, I said last week how the worst thing you could do to a man in a patriarchal society is to treat him like a woman, because you are degrading his God-given natural role as a man, the status that was higher than a woman. So unnatural is a reference to anything that breaks this obvious order of maleness, including and especially male power over women. Men having sex with other men was considered unnatural, at least in part because it violated gender roles. And the primary way that it was unnatural was because it forced one man to take the female role in the sex act, the role of being penetrated. That was a huge issue that was talked about in all of the ancient literature, and we're going to talk a little about that. There's actually this universal pattern in the ancient world, when they talk about same-sex eroticism. There's this universal pattern, particularly among men, that involve the status differences between what we would say is the active and the passive partners in that act. So one individual person, one man, would not take both roles, because the dominant penetrating man was always of a higher status than the man being penetrated. They were always older versus younger, always free versus slave, always of higher status versus lower status. This was the common pattern in all of the writing in the ancient world when they describe this. The connection between higher status and the act of penetrating is unquestioned in the ancient world, and it reflects deeply patriarchal assumptions about the relative status of men and women. The problem is, again, a man being, quote, degraded to that of the woman's role. So the problem is around patriarchy, it's around honor and shame, and so we heard Paul describe it as shameful, right? In that text, he's talking about a society where honor and shame is central to this conversation. In other words, just to summarize this, it was unnatural in a patriarchal world for a man to take anything that would be a woman's role. Paul describes that same thing about a man having long hair. It's degrading, and the reason it was unnatural was because women had less value. And that's what we need to understand. When he's talking about why it's unnatural, his assumption is it's a value assumption.
I have a question.
Will you write it down on your paper and turn it in? I've got to keep going. I'm going to run out of time. Sorry. So, one, when he talks about natural and natural is disposition. One is social order. The other is biological. There is a biological assumption happening in the ancient writers. And this you will hear again in the Jewish, you will hear it in early Christian writings, and you will hear it in Greco-Roman pagan writings. They will all talk about the natural and unnatural role of sex in terms of its biological purpose. So just a couple quotes from you. Josephus was a first century contemporary of Jesus and Paul. He's a historian. We have a lot of his writings that help give us a glimpse of the Jewish mind. This is what Josephus wrote. He's a Jewish teacher, and he's writing about from a Jewish perspective. What are our marriage laws? Listen how similar this is to Paul. The law recognizes no sexual connections except the natural union of man and wife, and that only for procreation of children. The only natural purpose of sex is procreation. Philo is another widely read, influential early Jewish philosopher. He starts writing during the life of Christ and a little bit after. This is what he says when he's describing same-sex eroticism. And let the man who is devoted to the love of boys submit to the same punishment, since he pursues that pleasure which is contrary to nature, and since, as far as depends on him, he would make the cities desolate and void and empty of all inhabitants, wasting his power of propagating his species. So the problem, again, it has to do with procreation. In fact, there's many other places where Philo directly points to procreation as the only point of marriage. Philo berates men who marry barren women and berates men who have sex with their wives during periods of infertility, because sex must be connected to procreation, or according to the ancient mindset, it is unnatural. And this is really key for us as we look at verse 26 in Romans 26, where it talks about women exchanging natural sex for unnatural sex. If you look at the first 300 years of Christian writers and interpreters of that text, they don't hear in that lesbian relationships. They interpret that. For the first 300 years of Christian history, they interpret that particular sex as women who are performing non-procreative forms of heterosexual intercourse. That's how it's interpreted by Clement, that's how it's interpreted by Augustine. That they are not, the natural and unnatural there is assumed to be heterosexual acts that are not going to be procreative. What's interesting is this, of course, has not gone away. Today, the Catholic Church still teaches in its writings and its connection to its opposition of gay or lesbian marriages, it still connects that opposition to the teaching that procreation is the essence of marriage. That's still the common teaching. So, along with that, I think what's interesting is if you go through all of the things that both traditionalists, all of the writings that traditionalists will quote and try to argue against this, not one ancient text specifically makes an allusion to the anatomy as being what is the point of natural and unnatural. Not one ancient text describes the fittedness of male and female anatomy as the point of what's natural. And this is what one scholar says about that. This is a striking and ominous silence, particularly in the argument where anatomical complementarity comprises the very heart and essence of the entire case against homosexual unions. It's a pretty ominous silence when no ancient writers make that connection, but we're trying to make that connection today. But what is important for us to understand is that when Paul speaks about natural and unnatural, his underlying assumptions is not this or this or this. It's all three of them simultaneously. That's how our minds tend to work with ideas, where we don't always delineate out. All of these are just sort of there, underlying how Paul is thinking and writing about what is natural and unnatural. And what is very, very clear is natural and unnatural in all ancient writings, including Paul's writings, are not synonyms for gay and straight. We have heard that because that's the question we're bringing to the text. Remember how I said earlier, the questions you bring into the text shapes where the text is going to take you. Well, if we're asking that question into the text, but it's not there in the ancient world, it's not there in Paul's mind. They are not synonyms for gay and straight. Oh man, I'm almost out of time. That was a lot of information. That was a ton of information. I do want to hear just a quick 3-minute clip from Julie again, and this is her describing her process of trying to live out this, trying to be straight, and ultimately it not working for her, because I would say it was unnatural for her to be in straight relationships. And so she starts by talking a little bit about her dating life and trying to date guys, and then says a few other things, and then we're gonna watch this quick clip, and then I am going to close with a few last comments.
And but I wasn't experiencing this shift that was supposed to happen. And I remember one day, one of the guys I was kind of dating at the time, I could tell that he was like kind of working up the courage to kiss me. And I was just like, gotta go, bye. And I rushed home and broke up with him on Facebook. And I know, right? And I remember sitting there after I sent the message, and I was probably like just after college at this time, and I was like, I'm gay. This is what gays do. Like, I broke up with somebody of the opposite sex over Facebook because they wanted to kiss me because I'm a lesbian. And I remember walking outside to my roommates, and they were like watching a game or something, and I just plopped down on the couch and I was like, I'm gay! And they were like, I know. And I was like, I don't understand, like, what's going on right now? Like, this is really traumatic. My whole life has been about not being gay, and I'm gay. And there's nothing I can do about it. And I remember going to the leaders of these ministries, I'm speaking for them. And I'm like, y'all, I'm like gay. Like, I'm really gay. And I love Jesus, and I'm all about scripture. Like, I was memorizing the book of Philippians when I was in middle school. Like, I love Jesus, I'm all in for this vision, but I am a lesbian. And they would be like, no, you're not gay, you're a child of God. And I was like, no, I know, I'm a gay child of God. And they're like, you're a beloved daughter of the King who struggles with same-sex attractions. So, like, here's the thing. There are no universes outside of conservative Christianity where same-sex attraction makes any sense. Like, it's just not a thing. And so I was kind of like, okay, like, it's just same SSA. But I was beginning to know inside of me that there was something fundamentally different about me and the way I was wired, my orientation. And it had been a source of shame my whole life. But I was also beginning to see this was part of this affected all of me. It wasn't just like, I wasn't a straight person who had like something misfire from time to time. This affected my friendships. This has affected my relationship with God. It led me to stand in solidarity with black friends or friends who are religious minorities or other people who seemed to be oppressed in some way. Even before I could give it all, like understood what was going on at the time, it led me to look to people and go, I think there's something, there was more empathy because of my orientation. And I was beginning to see, there was, even long before I could see the beauty in same-sex relationships, I could see there was something good here that God was using to bring about beauty around me. And around that time, I was beginning to see the effects of that teaching in these ex-gay communities on my friends' lives. I saw so many of them come and go. And I remember running into my friend Stephen on the streets in Dallas, who had gone to the Baptist college with me, was involved in a ministry with me. And he had left, and he got hooked on meth and ended up on the streets. And I would run into my friend Stephen from my Baptist college and see him on the street corner with sunken eyes and jagged teeth, asking if I could spare an old friend a little change. And I remember thinking, like, this is not okay. Like, he obviously was driven here because of all the shame that he was taught. He was taught that he was not a delight to God, that his body was not something beautiful and something that others could delight in. And it drove him to this. And I was beginning to see that in many, many people's lives. So I finally got to the place where I went to the leaders, and I eventually went to Alan Chambers at Exodus, and I was just like, I cannot be a part of this anymore. It's destroying my friends' lives, and it doesn't work. This is awful, and it needs to end, and I'm out.
So that's her story. And if you know the story of Exodus International and Alan Chambers, who is a part of that, you know, I mentioned this the first week, Exodus International was the largest organization leading reparative therapy that she was participating in and speaking for. Eventually, they came around and said, Julie was right. It doesn't work. We're sorry for the pain it's caused and the false hope it's created, and they shut the whole ministry down.
What was her last name?
Rogers, Julie Rogers. And I can put a link to her whole talk on the website when we get that up too. I do think it's important, though, to know that from the traditional perspective, what she would be hearing is, well, Paul describes a broken sexuality here, and we live in a Genesis 3 world, we're sin and we're all broken, and so we're sorry that you have SSA, same-sex attraction, but you have a broken sexuality, and that's what Paul's trying to describe in Romans. What I wish we had time for today, what we're going to get to next week, is read Romans again, and does it sound like Julie to you? Does it sound like Julie to you? This is one of my questions. We're going to next week dig into when Paul talks about lust and degrading passions and consuming passions with what is unnatural. What is he writing about? What is he picturing in his mind? There are actually some very particular common practices as well as common stories of political leaders of his day that it appears that he is alluding to. And so we're going to dig into that next week. Thank you for being here. If you have your questions or comments, write them down. Again, I'm going to do my best to try to get to some of those next week or in times beyond that. And we will also dig into the last two texts as a part of this conversation, which is the 1 Corinthians and the 1 Timothy text, which are often translated homosexuality or homosexual practice in a long list of sins. And it'll fit right into our conversation, the second half of this conversation with Romans 1. So that's the plan for next week. Friends, go in peace. Thank you.